Welcome once again, everyone. I'm glad you're all here today. Indeed, a special welcome to Bishop Mark, who's visiting with us this morning, and his wife, Sheila. Let's just take a moment and bring ourselves into that deep presence of Christ in our midst. And when you're ready, just take a nice deep breath and release. So we breathe in faith, and we breathe out doubt. We breathe in hope, and we release despair. We breathe in love, and we breathe out apathy. So Benno Christinet, welcome. And let us pray. Let us pray to the one who holds us in the hollow of his hands, to the one who holds us in the curve of her arms, to the one whose flesh is the flesh of hills and hummingbirds and angel worms, whose skin is the color of an old black woman and a young white man, and the color of the leopard and the grizzly bear and the green grass snake, whose hair is like the aurora borealis, rainbows, nebulae, waterfalls, and a spider's web, whose eyes sometimes shine like the evening star, and then like fireflies, and then again like an open wound, whose touch is both the touch of life and the touch of death, and whose name is everyone's, but mostly mine. And what shall we pray? Let us say thank you. So for those of you who have the book, we are actually I forgot to change this part, we are actually in chapter 2, which is on page 39. And we are beginning another section, Darkness and Beauty, a little subsection in this chapter. So while there can be no naive denial of the human capacity for hatred, injustice, and violence, Christianity insists that these have neither the first nor the last word in a cosmos that God has deemed good and beautiful. Perceiving this fundamental goodness, the Christian contemplative is one who falls in love with beauty and comes to embody that beauty through one's engagement in the world. Indeed, it is the vocation of the contemplative to shed the obstacles that prevent us from seeing truth and beauty in all. It is the vocation of the contemplative to shed the obstacles that prevent us from seeing truth and beauty in all. So our second reading this morning spans 39 to 40. It is all the more tragic then that Christianity has become associated in the popular mind with a body-hating worldview or with certain forms of doctrinal rigidity, institutional hypocrisy, scientific ignorance, and religious intolerance, assessments that too often bear merit. The rise of modern atheism in the West, along with the precipitous decline in church attendance, must be understood, at least in part, as a purifying corrective to the spiritual, moral, and imaginative failures of our religious institutions. The consequence of these failures is the church's diminishing capacity to convey beauty. It is, after all, beauty that attracts the human spirit and beauty that compels the human conscience toward the good, not the dry, rigid formulas of doctrine, nor the clinical dissection of biblical texts, nor the ethical demands to love, even before we ourselves have been made to understand not only that we are lovable, that's far too cliche, but that we are indeed love itself. So for those who are unable to stay with us for our conversation this morning, our closing prayer. This is a lovely prayer by E.E. Cummings. I thank God for most this amazing day, for the leaping greenly spirits of trees and a blue true dream of sky, and for everything which is natural, which is infinite, which is yes. Amen. So welcome back. I see a couple of chats coming through. Sure, Carol, I'll make sure Robert gets hold of that prayer for us. Okay, Brother Columba, please. I see your hand is up.
Yes, one thing what catch my my attention is that little sentence to remove the obstacles about the vocation of the contemplative. But isn't that something that comes forth out of contemplation, contemplative prayer, rather than it is a vocation? Maybe it's a stupid question, but that is what rises up in my mind.
Right. So first of all, there's no stupid questions. I think actually it's an excellent question, brother. And what I would want to suggest is, while we're several months away from my fuller response to your question, I do think that it's a both and. I think that when I get into chapter 4 and talk about asceticism, it was at least an idea attributed to Meister Eckhart, the idea that the spiritual life is more about subtraction than addition. So more about removing those obstacles that prevent intimacy rather than doing one more thing, one more devotion, one more set of prayers, right? One more meditation. But indeed, I think that there's a collaborative, co-creative effort where in what we would call active contemplation, we are attempting, right, through our meditative practices to remove those obstacles. But as the tradition is very clear, and I think what your question is getting at, that whole notion of infused or ultimately passive contemplation is where the grace rises up within us. So I've always come back to the image or the concept of tilling the soil so that the seeds that are being sown have a better chance, if you want to say, of sprouting. But as I've mentioned, I think it was several weeks ago, there's a paragraph where I kind of talked about, well, even a seed that's thrown on fallow land may well take root and grow, right? So grace will do what grace does and grow where grace grows. But what I'm trying to suggest here is that the contemplative life is about cooperating with that process within us through our efforts to live a contemplative life, as it were. Did that respond to your question? Good. Okay, great. Yeah, but thank you for raising that. It's an important nuance to understand the role of grace in all of this, or what, as I'm sure you're aware of. I don't know the in Netherlands what the word for passive contemplation would be, but in English, or infused contemplation, as we call it.
I will look for it, and then I will send it to you.
Okay, perfect. All right, Richard.
Good morning, all. Thank you for this. The last phrase also caught me: to remove obstacles, the scales from my eyes. It goes back to the exalted, the line, "O necessary sin of Adam." It's all necessary in God's play. In my limited understanding, there's what seems like enemy or other before me, but perhaps in God's unfoldment of us toward love, it is all beautiful. That which seems horrific included, all beautiful. It would take some real unpacking of my habitual seeing to meet that last line, to remove the obstacles from my seeing all as beauty. But it helps me in the exaltet to see, "O necessary sin of Adam."
Thank you, Richard. You know, one of the, this is not the first time or the last that I'll really try to explore the theme of beauty as it relates to the contemplative life. And Peter Oakes had a lovely line in one of his songs in the 60s that in a world of ugliness, the only protest is beauty, where he really talks about the spiritual value of reclaiming and really proclaiming beauty. And when we think about beauty, I mean, if you, for example, if you just Google the word beauty, 10 to 1, you're going to get a series of images of supermodels or something like this, of the kind of commodified beauty that the world has come to identify with that idea. But this, as we'll explore, is not what I'm talking about. I'm talking about the kind of beauty that moves us, that transforms us, that fills us with a hopefulness, and transforms our lives. So it's not this surface commodified kind of beauty, but the real deep down beauty that the gospel presents, and which I will argue later is grounded in the cross, right? That the cross becomes beauty and terror reconciled on some level. And I think, Richard, your comments may be pointing in that direction. So I agree that as we explore how Christians can look to the cross as something that's beautiful, when without that spiritual vision would see only horror, I think, moves us to where you're trying to go. So we will definitely have an opportunity to keep traveling down that road and look at what that's about. Thank you. Sylvia, please.
Oh, good morning. For me, when I find myself on every level just quickened to the point where I'm hardly breathing and my chest is pounding, is when I am able to come closer and closer to the realization that the illusion of my separation from God, from anything, is nothing more than that. It's an illusion. And that's almost, that is too much for my mind to grasp. It also brings what you just said, terror, when what my obstacle is preventing me from full intimacy with is something horrible. Like one of the destructive elements of our world, and there are countless of those. But when I am able to rest and really take in my separation from God, which is everything, is an illusion. And I don't put a solid matter definition on my obstacles. They're not solid granite, half domes. They are illusions. And that for me is the biggest jump to make, but the one that when I'm able to get closer to it, the intimacy, the longing for a reunion, for home, for becoming God's presence and gratitude, and just almost fainting love. Anyway, that's how I'm trying to hold obstacles.
Thanks, Sylvia. Your comment about, these illusions not being, these granite, concrete sort of structures, but just sort of illusions, puffs of smoke, things we think are there but aren't. It reminds me a little bit of the way in Paradise Lost, how he first describes Satan much like a giant whale, and by the end he's just this little bumblebee, right, in this sort of pit of darkness. But just how grandiose these illusions can seem or appear, but it takes but a little and they just disappear, right? But yet how powerful and how terrifying they can seem, and how solid and in their appearance and how real. And I do think that you're right to point to the ultimate nothingness of them, that our illusions are more about a lack of perception than something that's actually there. It's a deficiency, not a thing, not a positive, it's a negative. And when we begin to understand their literally their illusory nature, we can do what Martin Laird talks about: stand back and understand that as much as big mountains, those granite gigantic structures in our world feel solid, that we are those mountains, but often we mistake ourselves for the weather that those mountains tend to create around themselves. And the weather comes and goes, and now it's stormy, and now it's sunny, and now it's cold, and now it's hot. But he says, we're able to step back from the weather and remember we're the mountain, and that weather is just some passing something. So thank you for that, because it really evoked a lot of what I've understood but never quite thought of in that way. So thank you. Yeah. Yes, hi, Joy.
Hi. I like the very first sentence of the very first reading that you put up on the screen about while there can be no naive denial of the human capacity for hatred, injustice, and violence, Christianity insists that these have neither been the first nor the last word in the cosmos that God has deemed good and beautiful. Well, for me, the very first part of the sentence is that I cannot be naive or in denial about my own capacity for hatred, injustice, and violence. And it's something that I've moved into a deeper level recently with everything that's going on, and really looking at my belief systems and what I hold true to be about the world or about other people. When I read that sentence, that no naive denial of the human capacity, when I hear that, it's like, oh yeah, that's about them out there. No, it's about me in here. And it hasn't been until I've looked at my hatred, how I am unjust, and how my capacity for violence. It's after I've really looked at that and embraced it, not embraced it in doing it, but embraced it that it does indeed sometimes exist in me. Then I can go on to perceiving fundamental goodness and fall in love with beauty. We're such a paradox of feelings and emotions and stuff inside of us. And, when I embrace all of it, that's when I heal. That's when I bring God inside. and, let God experience that stuff inside of me. And I really get that's where the healing comes from for me.
Thank you, Joy. It's beautifully said. And I think you're right to point to, the sort of recent breakthrough, I think, in our collective consciousness around systemic racism in our country and so forth, as part and parcel of a larger human capacity for hatred and violence and injustice. It's just, now we have that capacity to do that self-interrogation around our, if not participation, at least our being complicit in this system. And then how looking at the illusions we put up about our own righteousness around this particular issue of racism, particularly for those of us who are white, is a necessary, sometimes painful, but very real step in the transformational process of really claiming, reclaiming, in a sense, beauty. So thank you for that. Very, very nicely said.
Yeah.
Carol, I think your hand was next.
It was so well said, Joy. I kind of feel bad coming after you. But, I'm new to the party, but we've been reading the book Radical Optimism in another group, and it's really coming. All of this stuff, like we were saying, the Black Lives Matter and all that, all the COVID, everything. I think it's really, like you said, a God's opportunity for us to see some things that I don't think I would have seen before. Like the concept that I'm not really a white woman born in 1958, that I'm really a soul that could have been born in a man's body or in a different race or none of those descriptors are me. And so all the things that cause violence in the world are us trying to hang on to those descriptors, or what we label as beauty, and when we let go of all of that and just see ourselves as soul, just like, I hate to say this in front of a bishop, but I mean, even Jesus was God being born into a male Jew in that time period, but that's not who God is. God was something past those descriptors. And so we need to see, if we let go of our own descriptors and let go of the descriptors on other people and really see the soul of God past that, then what is there to fight about? I mean, it releases, and that's what I've been thinking about when I go into prayer, is just to kind of release those attachments to being, because we use them as, I understand from a human level, but that's not who I really am. Who I really am is something, the true self is much deeper and infinite and not described by, when I get into heaven or whatever happens in eternity, it's not going to be, hi, Jesus, I'm a white woman that was born in 1958 and I'm a nurse and blah, 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 blah. That's not me. And Jesus isn't going to say, well, that's not the one I know. So anyway, that's just my kind of thoughts.
Carol, those are really helpful comments, and some of you may recall, and I'm not sure, Carol, if you were here when we talked about this, the notion of borrowed clothing and this lovely idea of when Adam and Eve sort of are sort of exiled into, are out of the garden, which is that symbolic place of consciousness around divine human unity, into that place of illusion that we were talking about, for example, that Sylvia raised. That there's this lovely little act where God sews, fig leaves or little loincloths together, right, and covers them. And that, in a sense, is what I talked about as borrowed clothing, those identities of the ego that we carry into the world. I'm a nurse, I'm a professor, right? All these things we shed, right? When we are naked before God, none of this remains ultimately. And so, but I try to also talk about them as neutral insofar as we can take up these identities, these socially constructed identities, and use them for good, or we can be invested with these clothes and use that power for terrible means, right? It depends. Is the ego under the control of the true self, that deepest identity in Christ, or is it under the control of false self, that spiraling of illusions that are trying to fix or to compensate for that sense of emptiness or existential angst or whatever that oblivion that they arise out of. So as we come to the recognition that our, as Augustine says, that Christ is more interior to us than we are to ourselves, or God is more interior to us than we are to ourselves. As we live into that reality, coming back to Brother Columba's point, it's the grace of that awareness that helps us shed those clothing to return again to that naked union with God. And then like a construction worker picking up that hammer and using it to build a home, at the end of the day, you put that tool down of the ego and you're just naked again before God. You don't identify with the hammer. You don't become the hammer. You recognize that egoic identity just as a tool that can be taken up and put down. And this takes skillful means, right? This is what meditative practice is about. Learning the difference between the mountain and the weather, between the tool and the one who wields it, between the musician and the piano, as it were. So it's understanding the deepest identity, Carol, that you're talking about, that becomes the practice, I think, that leads us and opens us to that grace of awareness.
And it's so hard in a society that values these descriptors, like that values the white people over the black people, over the men over the women. And I'm like, oh, but that's where the work is for us to also participate in the changing of that. So thank you. I'm gonna listen to this again and type out what you said.
Yeah. Well, and the opening prayer that we talked today, that the color of God's skin is the older black woman, the young white man, and the leopard and the lizard, and right, so that we begin to see in this panentheism of Christ in all, as Colossians would put it, Christ is all and is in all. We see that there's on the one hand the scandal of the particularity that you talked about in Christ's incarnation, this man in this body at this time with this, Jewish identity and so forth. There's a certain scandal to that, right? But that's also the beauty, because God can only come into the world of history in time, in space, in a particular moment, in our particular moment, right? And yet that's the beauty. So it's in all and everything as much as it's in any one thing, right? This is the beauty of it. So, okay, Gigi, I see your hand is up. Rosemary, is that you raising your hand there? Okay, I see two people just before you, and I'll come to your hand, okay? Gigi, please, I think your hand was next. And we just want to make sure we unmute, okay? You're still muted. There you go.
I somehow have this fantasy that once I raise my hand and you call on me, I'm unmuted. I forget. The Christian contemplative, the sentence that catches my attention, is one who falls in love with beauty and comes to embody that beauty in their engagement in the world. And I think that's hard. It's such a challenge when you look at engagement in the world from the core point of from the position of the contemplative and the love and attachment to beauty and that pure loving beauty of the contemplative. But I had an occasion to ponder that in real people this week. My former pastor, Brother Chris Bosch, died last Sunday. He was a pastor of St. Camillus in Silver Spring, Maryland, a multicultural parish including people from 80 different countries, a big parish. Chris arrived on the scene and immediately jumped in, getting scholarships for many of the children from Africa and Latin America into the parish grade school, to bringing the multicultural people together rather than in competition in the parish, struggles that you have. And Chris was so full of love that actually sometimes you looked at him and what he did and you thought, that's kind of silly. That homily he's getting is really funny. But he reminded me and so many others of St. Francis. He was a Franciscan, in that he had that love of deep physical love of God, and God presented in beauty, and God's love and beauty being in all people and all things. He did it. He became a contemplative who lived in a most loving, engaging way the love of God in ways that change people and changed churches. And I just feel so fortunate I knew a person like that, because I think it's so hard to try to strive towards a contemplative relationship with God in the world. And if Sylvia transmits this to me. Sylvia, you are an example of somebody who has that love and can live it. So I'm grateful for Chris. I'm grateful for all of you, and just that realization that what we read, Vincent, is possible. What you
Yes.
wrote is possible.
Yes, it is. And happening all the time, right?
Mhm.
We see it. I was talking to a friend just yesterday and saying all this beauty that happens, like with the pastor you're talking about, doesn't make it to the headlines, doesn't make it, right? We don't hear about the beauty of those ways in which people are engaging and transforming local communities, right? Individuals. But it's happening all over, right? And that's the beauty of it. It is there. It is there.
But we have to be blessed with encountering that and seeing it there,
Yes.
seeing it. Yeah.
That's right. Opening our eyes to it for sure. Thank you, Gigi. You're that beauty for me, by the way. So thank you. Hold on to that. All right. Okay, Sharon, please. I think you were next.
Hi, Father. This last week I I quoted the one of my favorite quotes. In the midst of winter, I found there was within me an invincible summer. But this week, in the midst of summer, I found in me such an invincible winter. And this exercise really shone a light on the obstacles within me that you're talking about, the obstacles that prevent us from seeing truth and beauty. So I'm kind of mad at you for this.
Wouldn't be the first time.
Because my week was not, and you know, it really, actually, to cap it off, this my real encounter with this came in sort of the imaginal world, where I fell back asleep this morning and had this crazy dream. But it was about this thing about how within me I do have so much anger towards the hypocrisy, the doctrinal rigidity. And in my dream, there was this woman who was spouting that at me. And, you know, I thought she was my mother, but she really wasn't. She didn't look like her. But anyway, I picked up a big old giant Bible and tried to hit her over the head with it. And it's funny because that's how I describe people like that they're using the Bible as a weapon and they're trying to beat people over the head with it. And here I was, not even being able to control that desire, except that my arms were really weak and the Bible was really heavy, and I really wanted to let her have it, but I couldn't. But within me, there was that drive, that desire to do violence, you know? So, yeah, it's kind of hard to be looking outside at the world, and, you know, I got plenty of work to do in here. But yeah, I'm, you know, when these things show up in my contemplative practice, you know, sort of my consolation prize is to say, oh, look at what's being purified from me right now. You know, like that was in there, and now I'm like saying goodbye on its way out. But that might be letting myself off the hook too easy. I'd like to know what you think about how to hold these things when they do rise up in us.
Yeah. Well, let me say that I thank you for sharing that sort of liminal space from this morning. I wonder if it isn't in part a grace that the Bible was too heavy for you to pick up in that moment. If there isn't a grace in that, the recognition that, first of all, you're right. The Bible has been, and will continue to be used as a weapon. It's one of the most painful things for me, both as a Christian, a priest, and even a biblical scholar, to see how abused the Bible is by people who want to, you know, bend it toward all kinds of death dealing and hateful means. But the fact that you couldn't pick that up says volumes about you, I think, in a sense that's speaking to me about something about your willingness not to simply turn this outward, but somehow the grace of understanding this is indeed an inward struggle, which is where I think a lot of the violence comes from, is when we project what we can't see in ourselves as others. That's almost a psychological truism at this point. It's become so obvious across the human spectrum. But I think that how we hold it is a function of giving over both to grace, right? The ability to expand, and when we can hold that, I think we start to see, believe it or not, in that very process, the beauty that I'm trying to get at. I talked in previous sessions that we talked about just in a few paragraphs ago, of the cross being a place where Jesus absorbs the evil rather than retaliates. And I should say that in post meeting, one of the participants wrote to me, and also exercise caution around that, insofar as what it means for a victim to simply try to absorb the violence that's done to them. And of course, it's not what I was getting at, but it's a cautionary point, right? How do we hold violence? How do we keep vigil over suffering that we can't transform or change, or that we have no power to do anything about? And I think the answer comes back always to being present to our practice, to coming back and saying, I can't, you must. I can't, you must. And how we have compassion on ourselves. I mean, look, Jesus turned over a lot of tables, in his own ministry. He wasn't afraid to call people out in ways that we would say are politically incorrect today, right? That are just sort of really abrasive and aggressive. And I think we have to dispense with the notion that the contemplative is always or only, this sort of a calm, passive, right? I think that the prophets of our tradition were pretty fiery people who knew when to point a finger and say, no, this is wrong, this is unjust, right? So how do we do that in a way that is able to remove the obstacles from my own capacity for vindictiveness, for anger, for violence, to see my capacity for that, to put it aside, right? And then to be able to act out of love, out of that sense of transformative beauty, and still respond in a way that's necessary against the injustices of the world, and toward ourselves. I don't think there's an easy solution, but I think the capacity to keep coming back to do that self-interrogation in the hands of a loving God is a foundational component of how each of us do that.
Thank you.
When we explore, Sharon, later in this chapter, we'll actually be looking at some paragraphs that try to actually tackle that in more nuance. So when we get there, hopefully that will be more response to what your question is.
This is good. Thank you.
You're welcome. Okay, and then we had one more hand before we move to our discussion of practice. Let's see, where were we?
Wasn't it Rosemary?
Yeah, it was. I'm looking for Rosemary on my screen and don't see her at the moment. Rosemary, did you want to go ahead and? Oh, there you are.
What I was thinking about, and it's certainly helping me in my experience and in my spiritual journey, is we recognize God in all of creation and all of humanity, and the people that are very difficult to deal with or to relate to, or sort of maybe affect us in any way. It is, for me, is seeing God created all of humanity, and God is in all of us, and seeing God in the other person helps me to love them, but not like their behavior. And in my experience, having dealt with people like that, those people have been just real stepping stones to my growth, and they have also shown in their way of responding they have responded in a more loving way. And I feel that if we see God in other people, no matter what they are, murderers or whatever else, I do feel that that is part of our contemplative stance in the world, and how we can bring love and that love energy out into the world, which the world needs so badly at this time with all that is happening. So those are some of my I just wanted to express that and get your response, Father.
Thank you. I appreciate the question, Rosemary. Yes, one example I can give is how, in a conversation with a friend a number of years ago, how we were talking about the sort of 1% and the sort of way in which the continual separation of the uber wealthy from the rest of us in the world, and the consumption of resources and so forth by that 1% was such a tragic injustice to the rest of us. But in that conversation, and so there is a tendency in us to always want to point up, to point at those who are, say, wealthier, who have more power, and so forth and so on, to blame, and how easy it is to target those particular demographics. But then, in the conversation, we both started to realize that for most of the world, we are up. For most of the world, those of us who are here present today are wealthier, more powerful, have more voice, have more freedoms and so forth than the vast majority of people in the world. And we're to them up. And I realized how we can apply that idea across the board to that notion of, again, our capacity to understand our own ability to be violent, to be hostile, to be self-interested and so forth, is the thing that helps me understand that probably anything that anyone has done that has offended me in the course of my lifetime, in some capacity, great or small, I have either done to someone else or am capable of doing, right? And so there's a sort of moral leveling that happens when we get off of our high horse and realize that I have these capacities. I am made up of these elements, and I have felt these resentments. And again, in a recent conversation, with a friend, we were talking about someone, a mutual acquaintance who is a profoundly powerful and toxic individual. And in that conversation, it kind of came out that what we realize is that individual doesn't understand their own beauty. They're so lost in their own illusory self, so bifurcated internally, so interiorly sort of struggling with their own sense of their identity and their own beauty, that they can't see who they are. And that becomes that thing that gets projected. And very often what we react to is that part of our own selves that also isn't reconciled, isn't embraced, isn't recognized, isn't unified in that great whole of who we are, right? It's part of the story we want to believe about ourselves, or the story we want to project about ourselves into the world, rather than the truth of who we are. So there's, I would say that, your own struggle with that, Rosemary, to see in this individual or individuals an opportunity for understanding this depth of your own capacity is exactly the contemplative practice, the spiritual practices that feed us and help transform us. It takes tremendous honesty. But the beauty, and what I keep coming back to in the book, what makes this work possible is not that we are, as Jonathan Edwards would say, in the sinners in the hands of an angry God, but we are in the hands of a loving God. And it's precisely in that confidence that we have the capacity to look with profound truth, and even with a certain stalwartness and confidence that this is how the transformation comes, by acknowledging and allowing God into those places. within ourselves.
And Father, wouldn't you, I would just say that it's all part, contemplative prayer has helped me in self-knowledge and reflecting on my own weaknesses and if you will, and faults, and then overcoming them, and then recognizing how to respond and how to relate.
That's right. So sometimes I like to say the Christian life is really about getting up one more time than you fall. That's all it is. It's that simple, right? And we just simply fall again and again and again, and we put our hand up and say, okay, I'm going to do this one more time. I'm going to do this one more time. And that is the optimism that I talk about in earlier paragraphs, that Christian optimism that insists that the grace will always be there to get up one more time than you fall. It's all you have to do. Just one more time.
Thank you, Father.
You're welcome. Thanks, Rosemary. All right. Okay, I know we're running a little bit after the hour, and now we typically turn to spending some time looking at a practice that I'll put out for you for this coming week, and then a little time discussing your practice from last week. So let me put that up on the screen for those of you who need to leave, and those who'd like to stay to discuss last week's practice. We can do that. So here's what I'd like to offer for our practice for this week. I want you all to meditate on beauty. You could simply meditate on the concept of beauty, or on someone or something you experience as beautiful. And then when you're ready, or when you feel inspired, write a one-line creed expressing your belief or experience of beauty. And simply start like this: I believe. And I'm asking you to condense it as best you can to one line, because that will really require precision on your part and a real tightening up. If it goes 2 lines, that's just fine. If it goes 3, that's okay too. But if you're able to sort of condense into a line, I believe, just let's see what emerges from that, because so much about the Christian spiritual life is about this reclamation of beauty. And I want to give you an opportunity to work with that. All right. So for those of you who need to leave us then for the day, Benum Christinet, I greet Christ in you. I wish you a lovely week, and go in peace and go in beauty. And for those of you who are able to stay, we'll turn then to last week's practice and have a little fun together, okay? All right, so God bless you all, and we'll see you sometime over the course of the week. Bye now. All right, okay. Let's see, let me put up then our practice from last week, and then I'll pull that down again for our conversation. So last week's practice. The doctrine of deification would assert that God is more interior to us than we are to ourselves. Yet we nevertheless experience dark nights or desolations, i.e., that is to say, an experience of God's absence, as well as moments of heavenly grace or consolations, as the tradition calls it. Moments where we experience God drawing near to us. So I'm asking you, or asked you this week, to attend to any such moments, and I wanted you not to allow them to sort of pass unattended, but to sort of be conscious, so that when you had a moment of consolation or desolation, you really were like, oh, that's what I'm experiencing right now. And then, of course, the question, what response does such a grace moment evoke in you? All right. So, Robin, I see your hand is up. You want to start?
So I really love having weekly exercises.
Oh, great.
It's very special to me, and I wrote my response to this one.
Okay, great.
Practice this week is a practice of remembering for me. When I remember, I experience that there is grace in every moment. I move into oneness with God and goodness and love, and feel the ecstasy of creation. This week I remembered on a walk at the beach, the glorious feeling of the sand between my toes, the miracle of my walking and putting one foot in front of the other and moving forward even without attention. The sense of wonder through my senses, feeling the wind sometimes carrying sand that stings my legs, the sound of the rolling waves, the vastness of the water, the wonder of the cliffs that trickle down pieces of themselves, the salty smell of the seaside, the awe of the miraculous creations of pelicans, seals, ravens, seagulls, sand dollars, crabs, seaweed, the joy of being present with the beloved family, the beauty in the ringing of the laughter of running children. What response do grace moments evoke in me? More grace, extreme gratitude, joy, and ecstasy or peace. And because of that, I am the 1%.
Beautiful, Robin. Thank you. Thank you. I suspect some may want you to post that. Would you be willing to give that to Robert for posting, or is that too private, too personal?
No, I'd be willing.
That's wonderful. Thank you. It's really, really beautiful. Kathy, I see your hand is up, please.
Yeah, I'm really grateful for this assignment, but it ended up transpiring in a really unexpected way. I meet with a professional twice a week. He's impeccably skilled, just a really true professional. But in our meeting on Monday, I just went away from there feeling really pained and not quite understanding what happened. I've been seeing him for 4 months, so it started coming to me that we're kind of now out of the honeymoon phase and into difficult relationship building. You know, that happens in all relationships. But I reached a point on Tuesday then where I was in such deep emotional pain that I just wanted to leave and go get something to numb it. And I haven't felt that much pain that I just wanted to have my whole being numb out to the maximum extent possible, even if it meant death. I mean, I didn't care. But I couldn't leave because I was expecting a package to replace one that had been stolen from my doorstep the day before. So I wanted to be sure I got this package. And so it meant I had to sit with this darkness. And of course, you know, I had, because I read your assignments over and over again to be sure that I can really sit with them each week, that it was really present that this was your homework assignment to us, that I needed to sit with this darkness, even though every part of me wanted to run away. And I started getting this, hearing this voice saying, garage mechanic. And so I just sat with that because it was so puzzling. Garage mechanic, really? And so I sat with it. It didn't make the pain go away at all, but it certainly gave me something to be curious about. And then I ended up journaling about it on Wednesday and got it flushed out a bit more, and then just read my journaling to him when I met with him on Wednesday. And it was so key to unlocking for him and for me what the stuck place was. And what that did for me is to see how the incredible value that's sitting in the deepest pain, in the blackest of black darknesses. And remember the scriptures that say that the dark cannot overcome the light. And then have this beautiful manifestation for how the light brings more healing and more grace than I could ever have expected. I mean, I think it was for him too, because he was able to own some of his character attributes that were getting in our way. I mean, they're lovely character attributes, but it's just they happen to be very triggering and not helpful. We needed to find another way through. So I'm just really grateful for being able to see how God is truly present in the darkness. I never had known it like I experienced it this week.
Kathy, thank you for that. Your sharing is always so rich and earnest, and I'm so inspired by your attentiveness to that and your authenticity around it. And I could only affirm, from my own experience, that same realization. It can be excruciating to sit in that darkness, and yet there's always a transformation that's come out of it for me. And if you want to call it a resurrection or a grace that comes, a light that comes from that. And so it's beautiful to hear. I mean, there you have, I think, the real promise of a God who can be trusted and to hold us in love. I forgot which of the early fathers talked about us all as pomegranate seeds, and that God is like the skin of the pomegranate that keeps us protected in what to us is darkness, but yet we can never see the pomegranate from the outside, because to be outside God is death, or as Merton says, is far too much privacy. And so in a sense, he talks about this beautiful idea of each of us, when we experience darkness, should understand ourselves as those pomegranate seeds held within the skin of the pomegranate. And I always found that to be a beautiful idea, because it transforms what we think of as darkness, and it becomes really a place of being held in not the absence of light, but being blinded by the abundance of light. Thank you. Linda.
Well, I was sitting out on my back deck one morning, and a little incident happened, and it occurred to me, this is one of those moments where, something is trying to be revealed to me or something. Anyways, there was this little bird in the backyard, and just normal, and I noticed it pecking at something in the grass, and then it pecked for a while, and then this other little dark thing would jump up and kind of move from it, and then the bird would catch up with it again and peck, 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 and that happened about 3 or 4 times, until finally, whatever the other little thing was, apparently had died. And then the next thing I knew, the bird had this thing in its mouth and was flying away, and I could see that it was a butterfly. And I thought, boy, the bird maybe was killing it or something to go feed his babies or something. And then I thought, well, good for the bird. And then I thought, well, but not too good for the butterfly. And I thought, then I was thinking, why do things have to die that other things can live? And that just, if we're to take cues through nature, and nature is our first Bible, say, why did God set it up that way, that something has to suffer and die for something else to live? And so I sat on, and this same thing has kind of gone through my mind in the past. But then I was thinking throughout the week, well, a couple of things. Number one, it's my perception perhaps of death as a negative thing, and suffering as a negative thing. And like Kathy was telling us this morning, through her suffering, great beauty came. And so, I need to change my perception on death and suffering. And then also, it occurred to me today, when several of you were speaking, Christ was in both of those little things, in the bird, in the butterfly, and how beautiful that is. And of course, there's the whole analogy to the cross, and the death of Christ, and what was brought forth through that. But that, I guess, that it was my experience in self-teaching, through the Holy Spirit, I guess, that I experienced this week.
Thank you, Linda. You know, your comments remind me of the beauty that surrounds this part of the world where we live here in West Marin. It is really strikingly beautiful. And it is undeniable that the landscape that we all find so beautiful is the result of tremendous seismic violence that's happened over the course of, you know, millennia and of millions of years. And sometimes with just tremendously devastating impacts on the landscape in the moment. And yet what grows out of that, none of the beauty we're seeing in terms of the landscape would be here without that violence, without that, those catastrophic moments that hit at any moment, right, and rattle this part of the world with tremendous violence. Or even as we're, you know, seeing what scientists believe to be the most diverse epoch in the Earth's history, which all emerged from the 1% of species that survived the last great extinction. This tremendous diversity growing out of that 1% is unfathomable, because when you think about how much destruction the last major die-off caused, I mean, the suffering would be hard on any day to even grasp on any level. And yet here we are with this beautiful, unfathomable diversity. So to me, this is the big book of the Bible, creation, speaking, insisting on resurrection, right? That the cross is not the end, and suffering is not the end, and death is not the end, and violence and injustice are not the end. So, but when you're in the midst of it, it's brutal. And whether that's interior struggles, right? Those interior desolations, like the kind Kathy was just talking about, or those, Linda, that you're talking about. Why does death have to happen to keep others alive? These are deep, mysterious questions, but insofar as creation is the big book of Scripture, it's worth exploring and plumbing, because there's something there. And I think it speaks to the same pattern of the Christian Paschal mystery of dying and rising. Somehow there's a resonance, I think, there, and a deep mystery. Thank you. Cindy.
Yeah, I had a meditation very similar to Linda's. I was sitting outside and I was watching a hawk that was spying all the little birds that were coming to my bird feeder. And it was just waiting there patiently for the right moment. And it swooped down and took off with a blue jay in its mouth. And as I watched, it was the first time in my life that I didn't feel pangs of pity for a creature, like you were mentioning toward the butterfly, Linda. And so I reflected on that, because I was watching it and I was thinking, this is the way things are. That the web of life is such that everything is food for something else. The entire world is food for something else. And my meditation took me to the place of the realization that all of creation itself is Eucharistic. You know, every part of creation giving its body for another part of creation.
Mm. That's beautiful, Cindy. I've never thought of it that way. And that's the whole of creation is Eucharistic, giving its body for the life of another. Mm. Thank you. Yeah. Christine.
For me, this practice for me, desolations, I'm realizing, have so much to do with judgment. How I perceive others judging me, how I judge others. And for me, whether I'm going to a place of consolation or desolation, in the deepest part of that, what evokes in me are tears. So tears of compunction, tears of not knowing, tears of being judged, tears of judging others. And then in the beautiful moments of feeling God's love completely suffusing me and going through me to others. And is so beautiful that I move to tears. So for me, either one is a total full body givenness is all I can say. That is just overwhelming, and what flows out are tears. That's just my response. And I have to believe that that is living water, that is grace-filled living water.
Well, Christine, I know you know the gift of tears from the desert tradition is right there. Yeah, right in you. It's beautiful. Thank you. Is there anyone else before we close for today?
Just a little epilogue to my own reflection is that it seems to me that Eucharist is encoded in the very DNA of reality.
That's right. That's right. Amen to that.
What has come to me from the last 2 weeks is that it doesn't seem possible for me to vilify another without becoming a villain. And that is stopping me in my tracks. I'm not nearly as judgmental as I was. I wish to thank you, Father Vincent, for these wonderful exercises.
You're welcome, Robert. I have a hard time believing you were ever a judgmental person, but I'll take your word.
On that point, I don't lie.
Well, it's beautiful to see the transformation. Thank you. Thank you. Well, as always, I'm truly, from the bottom of my heart, grateful for all of you and for what you bring to my spiritual life and the insights and the beauty and the sincerity. And it's both a challenge and a gift to me to stay the course. So thank you again for your sharing. I know this will be posted by Roger within a few days. He's so good at that. And I, of course, remain grateful always for his work behind the scenes on all of that. And all the archives, as you know, can be found on the Meditation Peace Chapel website. So hopefully we'll see some or all of you throughout the week at our various offerings here from St. Columba's. And for those I don't see, then have a lovely week. And I look forward to seeing you all next Saturday morning, afternoon, and evening, depending on where you are in the world. and I bid you Benum Christ in the meantime.